powerful black judge humiliated, shaved bald by a racist officer inside her own courthouse. But just hours later, she returned to the bench. What she did next, it rewrote the rules of justice. You won't believe how this real-life courtroom drama unfolds. It was a chilly Monday morning in Farrell, North Carolina. The city was still half asleep as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the plaza in front of the Farrell County Courthouse, casting a soft golden hue over the marble steps. The sound of heels clicked rhythmically. Judge Noelle Warren, a 52-year-old black woman, former federal prosecutor, and now one of the few female judges in the region, stepped out of a silver Chevrolet Impala. She held a slim leather briefcase in one hand and wore a navy trench coat over her shoulders. Her silver curls were neatly pinned back, revealing a calm, resolute face. She wasn't wearing her judicial robe. That was Noelle's principle. I walk into the courthouse as a citizen first, only then as a person in power. She had passed through the security entrance hundreds of times, but this morning felt different. At the security checkpoint stood a new officer, Tret Madsen, around 45, tall and broad-shouldered, with a gaunt face and a dry, abrasive voice. He looked at her as if she had snuck into the back door. "You there," he said gruffly. "Step out of line." Noelle frowned slightly. "Is there a problem, officer?" Instead of answering, Madsen glanced her up and down. Her tailored slacks, her polished brown leather boots, then finally her unwavering eyes. No name tag, no badge, dressed like a lawyer. "Who do you think you are?" he growled through clenched teeth. Remaining composed, Noelle slowly reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her federal judiciary ID. "I'm Judge Noelle Warren. This is my identification." The card gleamed under the light, but Madsen didn't even glance at it. He snatched it from her hand and stuffed it into his pocket. "I'll have to verify this. In the meantime, you're coming with me." She stiffened. "I do not consent to being detained. You don't have the authority to do this." But he had already grabbed her arm. Not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to assert dominance. A younger officer near the baggage scanner turned his face away. The woman manning the card reader lowered her head in silence. Noelle was pulled from the line and escorted down a quiet hallway. A heavy metal door closed behind her with a chilling click. Inside a small, windowless room stood a single metal chair and a table with inspection tools. On it sat a set of electric clippers. "You're acting very suspicious," Madsen said, arms crossed. Noelle gripped the strap of her briefcase tightly. "You have no justifiable cause. I do not consent to a search." But her words were drowned out by the buzz of the clippers. Two more officers entered the room. Neither spoke, neither asked. One held the chair. The other forced her to sit. "Tell the truth, or things will get worse," Madsen said. "That hair could be hiding something." Noelle didn't even have time to speak. The cold blade of the clippers pressed against her scalp. Silver curls tumbled to the floor, each strand falling like a fragment of her dignity. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She only clenched her fists, her breath sharp and heavy, but her eyes remained calm. "Look at that," one of them sneered. "Guess she finally knows her place." Noelle whispered, "You're going to regret this." But they laughed. They had no idea that the woman being shaved bald in front of them was the same person who would soon sit at the highest bench in this courthouse. The sound of the clippers faded, leaving behind a silence that weighed heavy in the air. Strands of silver curls lay scattered across the gray tile floor, silent evidence of an unspeakable violation. Noelle Warren sat motionless in the metal chair, her back straight as a ruler, her gaze fixed firmly ahead. She said nothing in protest, nor did she bow her head in shame. Inside her, rage rose like a tide, but was a fury tightly bound, restrained by the discipline of someone who had learned how to steel herself against gunfire, against power, and against the eyes of those who doubted her. Tret Madsen leaned against the wall, arms crossed, smirking. "Now that looks more like it," he said with a cock of his head. "Get out. I'm off the clock." Noelle stood slowly, never once looking at him. She walked out of the small room, leaving behind the dry echo of his laughter reverberating down the hallway. Each of her footsteps rang out in the silence, not trembling, not rushed, but steady, unshaken. The light scratches on her scalp stung as the cold air crept through the corridor, but she didn't raise a hand to touch them. She let the pain stay as a reminder, not a weakness, but of strength. As she passed through the main lobby, the eyes of clerks, administrative staff, and security officers began to turn toward her. Some looked away, pretending to be busy. Some stood frozen. And a few, the ones who knew who she was, fell into stunned silence as though they were witnessing something unimaginable. She didn't blame them. She didn't need their pity. She just needed to keep walking. Outside courtroom 2B, two clerks stood upright as she approached. One of them started to speak, then hesitated. Noelle simply gave a small nod and stepped past the heavy wooden door. The room fell into silence. Every eye turned to the woman who had just entered. Her head bald, her navy trench coat draped over a simple black business suit, a slim leather case in hand. They didn't recognize her at first. But then, as she approached the bench, placed down her case, opened it, and pulled out the neatly folded black robe, they understood. Judge Noelle Warren, the woman they had mistaken for a suspect, now stood before them. Not angry, not vengeful, but cold, commanding, and utterly composed. She draped the robe over her shoulders as if reclaiming her dignity. The courtroom fell into such silence that the faint clatter of a pen hitting the floor could be heard. The bald woman who had just donned the black robe now stood behind the judge's bench, and every person in the room was stunned into stillness. The humiliation she suffered that morning hadn't broken her. It had transformed her into the embodiment of a quiet storm, poised to sweep through and expose the rot inside a system once thought untouchable. Reporters whispered to each other. Cameras began to rise silently from corners of the room. Attorneys on both sides, the plaintiff and the defense, were visibly shaken. A few security guards in the back stared open-mouthed. But at the very center of it all, the most rattled person was Officer Trent Madsen, the man who had pressed electric clippers against this woman's scalp just hours earlier. He stood by the door, shrinking back as if trying to disappear into the wall. His face had gone pale, his eyes blinked rapidly. Sweat dripped down his temple. His collar was soaked, and his hands tightened unconsciously around his belt. His mind was racing, thinking about the surveillance footage from the holding room. The camera that had captured every second of the clippers buzzing to life, every sneer, every condescending glance. A young guard standing next to him whispered, eyes wide, That's her?" Now seated at the highest bench in the room, Noelle Warren didn't look at Madsen. She didn't raise her voice. But her very presence had changed the air itself, from heavy and quiet to charged and volatile. In the gallery, a few spectators pulled out their phones, not a text, but to live stream. Within 5 minutes, a new hashtag was trending across social media. #SheIsAJudge. A middle-aged woman leaned toward her seatmate and whispered, "I saw her being taken away this morning. They treated her like a criminal." The other woman stared in disbelief. "And now she hold the gavel. My God." The plaintiff's attorney rose, voice catching slightly as he confirmed his presence. The defense attorney, flustered, dropped his pen before finally saying, "Present," though his eyes never left Noelle's bald head. Noelle didn't wait for the clerk. Her voice rang out, clear and strong, without a microphone. This hearing, as scheduled, concerns a civil case alleging misconduct by the Fairhill Police Department. But this morning, I became living proof of the very abuse we are here to expose, the misuse of authority, the violation of dignity, and the silent complicity that enables it. And I cannot, in good conscience, sit here and pretend justice is functioning as it should, when those sworn to uphold it assaulted, degraded, and humiliated me within the walls of this very courthouse. A wave of whispers rippled through the courtroom, but with a single raised hand, Judge Noelle Warren brought it all back to silence. "Officer Trent Madsen, step forward and state your full name for the record." Madsen didn't move. A young security officer standing nearby began to step in, but Noelle shook her head. "I'm not issuing command. I'm giving you a choice. Step forward like a man, or be dragged like someone who's forfeited that right." The room felt starved of oxygen. The silence stretched, suffocating. Finally, the sound of Madsen's black leather shoes echoed in heavy, reluctant steps. He walked to the center of the courtroom, standing a few feet from the bench, his eyes fixed on the floor. "My name is Trent Allen Madsen." "Years of service?" Noelle asked, her gaze unblinking. 18, he replied hoarsely. She opened a thick case file. The sound of paper turning echoed with weight. "In those 18 years, you were named in 12 formal complaints, most from women of color, citing abuse of power, coercion, and degradation of dignity. All 12 were dismissed without investigation. Why? Because none of those women had the title or status for their voices to matter. A few reporters lowered their heads to scribble notes furiously. Camera shutters clicked without pause. From the federal prosecutor's table, a man rose to his feet. Noelle gave him a small nod, an unspoken cue long agreed upon. "I request the immediate opening of a criminal case against Mr. Trent Madsen for abuse of power, violation of civil rights, obstruction of justice, and humiliation of a federal official." Madsen opened his mouth to protest, but just then, a new officer entered the courtroom. He walked up to Noelle's bench and placed a small USB drive on the table, speaking softly. "This morning's footage has been secured." Noelle gave a single nod, then issued her command loud and clear. "Officer Trent Madsen, you are hereby placed under arrest in accordance with federal civil rights statutes. Officer Davis, proceed with the handcuffs and escort him out." The courtroom didn't erupt in cheers, but the silence that followed was louder than any roar. Madsen was handcuffed on the spot. No one intervened. No one objected. Noelle watched as he was led away, her expression free of hatred. But for anyone who understood the law, one truth rang clear in her eyes. Justice was never delayed, only waiting for the right moment to rise. As Madsen was escorted out in handcuffs, Noelle turned toward the parties involved in the civil case, her gaze sharper than ever. What you just witnessed was not a random incident. It was a consequence of a system that has long been allowed to excuse and enable abuse of power. And now, it's time we begin dismantling it, link by link. The courtroom was silent. Every eye remained fixed on her, not because of the bald head, but because of the voice that didn't waver, the gaze that didn't flinch, and the resolve that now spread like fire through dry grass. The hearing wasn't over. It had only just begun. Less than 3 hours after Trent Madsen was let out of the federal courtroom in handcuffs, the video of that morning's events had exploded across every major social platform. Leaked security footage, from Noelle Warren being pulled away, detained in a private room, to having her head forcibly shaved while others watched in detached silence, ignited a media storm unlike anything seen before. On Twitter, the hashtag Justice for Judge Warren topped the trending list within 40 minutes. CNN, MSNBC, the North Carolina Post, and numerous other major outlets broke the story in unison. At the North Carolina Department of Justice headquarters, an emergency closed-door meeting was convened at 4 p.m. Miles Harrington, director of the Office for Civil Rights, cleared his schedule and boarded the first flight to North Carolina. Back in Fairhill, protesters began gathering outside the federal courthouse, but they didn't chant. They stood in solemn silence, each holding a sign that read, "Her silence was not consent. It was warning." Inside, Judge Noelle Warren sat alone in her chambers. Her robe was draped over the back of her chair, while she wore a plain black shirt. Her bare scalp remained uncovered. On the desk in front of her were dozens of urgent emails, some from congressional representatives, others from federal agencies and human rights legal organizations. But she hadn't responded to any of them. She simply sat there, holding the USB drive, her eyes fixed on the screen as it replayed the moment she was forced into the chair, her neck restrained, and the buzz of clippers filling the room, cold, mechanical, beat by beat. The door creaked open. Jasmine, her young assistant, entered, pale-faced and carrying a new folder of documents. "Judge," she said softly, "someone from the Office for Civil Rights is here, and the White House press office just called." Noelle lifted her head and gave a slight nod. "Send them in." A few minutes later, a tall man in a tailored gray suit entered the room. The silver lettering on his name badge read, "Miles Harrington, Federal Office for Civil Rights." He took a seat across from her and placed a sealed envelope on the desk. "Judge Warren," he began, "I've been sent here as a special envoy." We are launching a full-scale federal investigation, not just into what happened this morning, but into the entire operational framework at Fairhill. That includes complaint intake processes, promotion practices, and most urgently, how complaints against Officer Madsen were repeatedly buried. Noelle looked at him, her face unreadable. I hope this isn't just for show. It's not, he replied. This time, no one stays on the sidelines. The Attorney General signed a directive personally. The White House is watching this case closely. The Senate may even call a special hearing if necessary. Jasmine's voice trembled. They're going to question former judges who mishandled the old complaints. Harrington nodded. Even those who signed to dismiss them. The air in the room thickened. Noelle stood up, her eyes resolute. I won't back down. Not for them. Not for me. But for every person who was dragged away in silence like I was. Only no one was filming. The next morning, Fairhill awoke under a different sky. There were no more indifferent glances in courthouse hallways. No more footsteps passing each other without acknowledgement. In their place was a silence filled with reflection, and every step, every nod now carried weight. Inside courtroom 2B, the civil hearing on abuse of power resumed. When Judge Noelle Warren entered, the entire room rose, not out of protocol, but instinct. They had seen a woman stripped of her dignity, and still, she stood up, put on the robe of justice, and faced a man who tried to destroy her honor. And now, they understood not everyone has the courage to do that. On the witness bench, a middle-aged man sat with his hands tightly clasped. His name was Louis Bryant, a retired courthouse technician who had left nearly a decade ago. He was the first to voluntarily contact the judge's office that morning, asking to testify. I saw him do something similar to a young intern once, he said, his voice raspy with emotion. He didn't shave her head, but he shoved her to the ground, said she looked suspicious. She left the profession that same day. No one said a word. I didn't either. But today, I can't stay silent anymore. His words froze the entire room. Noelle didn't have to respond. A single solemn nod and the heavy silence that followed said everything. By midday, something unexpected happened. Jasmine Park, a soft-spoken 24-year-old court clerk, requested permission to speak. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes never left the judge's bench. I stood still when he pulled someone out of the security line, she said, her voice shaky but clear. Not because I didn't know it was wrong, but because I thought I was too small to make a difference. But it's our silence that gives them power. I'm sorry, Judge Warren, and thank you for not staying silent. The courtroom went still. Then a quiet ripple of applause broke the air. It wasn't for her words or any grand lesson. It was because, for the first time, the silence had been broken. Outside the courthouse, signs began to appear. We stand with Noelle. Justice has no color. No one is above the law, not even security officers. Those who had once been victims began to speak out. Old emails were unearthed. Complaints that had been tossed into wastebaskets now sat squarely on the desks of federal investigators. And at the heart of this rising tide, Noelle Warren didn't cast herself as a victim. She became the symbol of something larger, an awakening. No one could look away now. No one could pretend they hadn't seen. 10 days after the incident, Fairhill had yet to return to normal. But inside the federal courthouse, a profound change was taking root. Gone were the hushed conversations behind closed doors and the avoidant glances in the hallways. Now, people met each other's eyes. And at the center of this tectonic shift stood Judge Noelle Warren. On Monday morning, she walked into the courtroom, not in her usual robe, but in a simple black blouse. The patches of shaved scalp were still visible, but her eyes burned with fierce determination. In her hands was a thick manila folder, the cover stamped boldly with the words, Warren Reform. Before we begin this morning's hearing, she said, her voice calm and deliberate, I would like to announce a new reform package, effective immediately for the entire judicial system of Fairhill County. The room fell into absolute silence. She held the folder high. This program will include mandatory anti-bias training for all courthouse staff, regular oversight reviews with public participation, an anonymous whistleblower hotline with full protection guarantees, and finally, a zero-tolerance policy for any act of discrimination. In the back rows, people began to nod. Note-taking pens no longer recorded testimonies. They were now writing history. And then, just when it seemed everything had settled, the climax erupted. Lester Doyle, the court's chief administrator, a white man in his 60s with silver hair and a longtime ally of the previous chief judge, shot to his feet. "Judge Warren," he said loudly, "you cannot unilaterally impose these measures across the entire system without going to federal judicial council." Noelle turned to face him, her eyes as still as a frozen lake. "I'm not imposing them, Mr. Doyle. I'm initiating them. And under Article 21-6 of the court's Internal Governance Code, a federal judge may propose emergency reforms in response to credible civil rights violations within their jurisdiction." She opened the folder to its first page. There is credibility. There are victims. There is evidence. And now there is a community ready to change. Before Doyle could respond, a wave of applause rose from the gallery, gentle at first, but building, spreading. Noelle didn't smile, but her gaze shone brighter than it had in years. Not because she had won, but because, for the first time in a very long time, she felt something she thought she had lost. Hope. Hours later, the official court website published the full content of the Warren reform. Nearby courthouses began requesting copies to review for implementation. An article in the North Carolina Post called it the first formal response from a harmed individual to turn public humiliation into the cornerstone of institutional reform. Meanwhile, in her office, Noelle sat alone, eyes resting on the printed draft of the reform plan spread across her desk. Outside, the maple leaves had turned crimson. Fall in Fairville could be cold. But from now on, justice had a face more defined than ever before. And then came the day everyone had been waiting for at the Fairville County Courthouse. Sentencing day. The courtroom was packed. There wasn't an empty seat in the gallery. Some people stood shoulder to shoulder in the hallway. Others huddled behind the attorneys' benches, phones in hand, recording. The air was thick, as if everyone was holding their breath, awaiting a historic moment. Trent Madsen walked in, no longer the officer people once made way for. The uniform was gone, replaced by a dull orange prison jumpsuit. His hands were cuffed at the front of his waist. His eyes were swollen, his chin unshaven, and every step seemed to drag like he was trudging through mud. There was no arrogance left, only a man now facing the full weight of what he had done. Judge Noelle Warren sat high on the bench, her hand resting lightly on a thick case file. The detailed judgment from the trial on Madsen's charges: abuse of power, civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and assaulting a federal official. She wore no robe today. Instead, she chose a simple black blouse. Her hair remained closely cropped, a reminder that truth needs no embellishment. "Mr. Trent Madsen," Noelle began, her voice calm but sharp as a razor. "This court has heard all evidence, testimony from victims and witnesses, and reviewed the incontrovertible video footage. You are found guilty on all counts." Madsen said nothing. His head hung low, his hands clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white. "For your abuse of authority and violation of civil rights," Noelle continued, "you are sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. An additional 3 years are added for obstruction of a federal investigation. That is a total of 9 years, with no parole, no bail, and no eligibility for early release until at least 85% of the sentence is served." Murmurs swept through the courtroom. A few people clapped softly before quickly falling silent, but their eyes glowed like a spark of justice had finally reignited after years of being smothered. Noelle leaned forward slightly. "And now for the part that's not in the file, the human part." She paused, locking eyes with Madsen. "You didn't just strip me of my hair. You stripped away the safety of a citizen. You made dozens of victims live in fear because they had no title, no microphone. But today, they have a voice. And you have nothing left but accountability." Madsen shivered, his lips parting slightly as if to speak. But he said nothing. As federal officers stepped forward to cuff and escort him out, Noelle added, "This time, for the entire room to hear. The court was never built to serve power. It exists to illuminate the truth, even if that light blinds some along the way. The back door swung open, and the afternoon light spilled in, shining across Noelle's bare scalp, unhidden, unashamed. From a back row, a young black woman stood, holding a copy of the War and Reform. She said nothing, just nodded, and Noelle smiled back because she knew the real work was only just beginning. A week after the sentencing, the front lawn of the Fairhill Federal Courthouse became a quiet gathering place for people who had once been too afraid to speak. There were no angry signs, no chance for justice, just eyes filled with gratitude and quiet nods as Noelle Warren passed by. Not in a judge's robe, but in a simple black blazer, her head still bare, the scars still healing, her eyes burning bright. The media called her the woman who redefined the bench. An editorial in the North Carolina Post described her as a mirror held up to a decaying system, forcing society to finally see itself. But Noelle didn't care about titles. What mattered to her were the eyes that once looked away, now meeting hers. The court employees who once stayed silent, now speaking out. The young people from law schools, churches, and local communities who came to sit in her courtroom, just to witness. One afternoon, after a closed-door meeting with senior judges, Noelle paused in a hallway where a group of law students had gathered. A petite, brown-skinned young woman, clutching a copy of Federal Civil Rights Procedure, stepped forward. "Judge Warren, I just want to say if it weren't for you, I probably would have dropped out last year." Noelle placed a hand on her shoulder and smiled. "Then remember this. You don't need anyone's permission to speak up. You just need to know why you're speaking." The girl nodded, eyes glistening. Across social media, from New York to Oakland, the hashtag Warren Standard became a symbol of principled justice reform. Elementary students drew pictures of her in a black robe, standing strong beneath a blazing sky. Law schools invited her to speak. Policymakers quoted her during congressional hearings. Survivors of abuse, both physical and emotional, quietly sent letters to her office, each one a buried wound now unearthed by the courage of a woman who refused to bow. But Noelle never saw herself as a hero. At a press conference at Howard University, when asked how it felt to become a modern symbol of justice, she replied, "I didn't fight to become a symbol. I fought so the people who come after me wouldn't have to endure what I did. If anyone sees something worthy in me, then I hope it's this, that even when your dignity is stripped away, you can still rise and rebuild right from where you were broken." And so, like a circle closing at last, from the silence of that first day, dragged into an unnamed room, head shaved as if she were invisible, Noelle Warren emerged. No shouting, no revenge. She just kept walking, each step steadier, each step a statement. That evening, Noelle sat on her front porch, beside a steaming cup of tea and the updated draft of the War and Reform. The changes were spreading. 2 other states had just invited her to share insights. 3 county-level judicial agencies had officially adopted anti-bias measures modeled after her plan. She looked up at the sky, not searching for peace, but for clarity, because for Noelle Warren, justice had never been a destination. It was a journey, and with quiet strength, she had helped lead others back onto the path.